My name is Olivia, and I have a collection of strange stories throughout my life that I would like to share with you. The first was when I was in 3rd grade. My grandpa had just finished building, painting, and laying carpet in my room. He builds rooms to single-wide trailers. My mum was directly across from their room, and my grandma made me a pallet on their floor to sleep in until the paint had dried completely. To be clear, I was an only child at the time, and no one else lived with us. It was maybe 8 at night and storming outside, so I was a little afraid of falling asleep. I caught myself tossing and turning, trying to get comfortable, when out of the corner of my eye I saw a figure in the doorway. I focused on the door, and what I saw had me frozen in fear. A little girl in period clothing was standing there staring at me. She appeared to be 6 or 7 and had ringlet curls with ribbons, lacy socks, and a frilly little dress and dress shoes. She had a gloomy look on her face and just stood still staring. She was almost transparent, with a glowing blue tint to her silhouette. I finally broke free of my trance, had covered my face and counted to 10, and when I opened my eyes, she was no longer there. A few years later, this next story happened, and to give you a tiny bit more context, we lived on a dirt road about 30 minutes or so away from any town. I only had 2 neighbors and none of them had any pets. At this point I was about 11, and I was sleeping in the room facing the road from our front yard. My window was directly above my head, and I heard my dog barking outside. This irritated me. I got up to see what she could possibly be barking at. I cannot to this day understand what I was seeing. There were approximately 12 dogs in a weird triangle formation that I have never seen before, even to this day. They were sitting down looking straight ahead at my dog, who appeared to be pacing, barking between the rest. When she would stop, they would bark one at a time in response almost. I rubbed my eyes in disbelief and paused in fear. The dogs varied in breed and size. The only thing I recognized was my neighbor's dog. I sat there and watched them as long as I could stand, but eventually just accepted it as a weird occurrence and laid down, knowing there was nothing I could do about it. Sometime around 2012, I had a friend over for one of our weekly sleepovers. On this night, we stayed up late. We always tried to see how long we could stand fighting sleep for and enjoy delirium and scaring ourselves with scary stories and experiences. It was around 3 a.m. and we were sitting on the floor quietly talking because my grandfather had been at work that morning early and we didn't want to upset him like we had on nights before by being loud and obnoxious. It wasn't long after 3 that my grandpa burst into my room, absolutely furious. He sternly scolded us, saying how he saw us under the outside light, and told us that we would be in big trouble if he ever caught us out there at that time again. We were absolutely dumbfounded by this. We'd not left the bedroom all night because we scared ourselves with ghost stories. I told him he must be mistaken because we had no intention of going out in the dark, but he didn't believe us. The worst part about this, we only had maybe 2 or 3 neighbors at the time, and none of them were teenagers, and we were half hour from any town. I could not even to this day find any explanation for this, and he never did believe us. He swore it was us, and saw it clear as day. A few months down the line, I was outside playing with my little cousin, who was maybe 10 or so at the time, and we decided to jump on the trampoline. It was starting to get dark outside, but we chose to remain playing because, as I said, we lived in the middle of nowhere with nothing to do but be outside. We were playing Crack the Egg when the strangest thing happened. Behind my grandparents' trailer were 2 sheds. One was directly in front of the trampoline, and the other was maybe a couple of 100 feet away from us to the right. In the middle of the game, my cousin stopped playing and was staring off into the distance, so I looked over to the shed, the furthest from us, and there was something floating directly above it. The only way I know to describe it is that it looked like the Gravitron at the fair. It had lights circling around it and beams of light facing the sky and the roof of the shed. The weirdest part of it all was the complete silence. Not a sound came from it. It was floating and completely still. Once I regained control of myself, I ran inside to tell my grandparents. The trailer was right behind us, so I was there in less than a minute. I told them what I saw and they followed me outside. But of course, it was gone. Not a single noise was heard and it vanished. I asked my cousin where it went, and he couldn't explain or comprehend what he had experienced. I never saw it again, and it still doesn't make any sense. Sometime around 2016, I was staying over at a friend's house. There's a lot of lore pertaining to her and her old 1800s house that her father had purchased and started renovating that may have led to these events, but some of that information is a little too personal to share here. Also, I pretty much lived here with her at this point, spending weeks at a time at her house. The house was just a plain brick home in a decently sized neighborhood, but we believed her father bringing items in such as pictures found in the walls, windows, and letters from the home in the country and discovered in an old mine could have been the cause of the strange activity. Before we parted ways for the morning, she had asked me to trim her hair for her, so I did. When we were finished, she stayed behind to clean up the mess, so I went into the living room and got on her laptop, put in headphones, and played 8-ball pool. Very exciting, I know. 10 minutes later, she walked into the room with a decidedly blank expression. I removed my headphones to ask her what was up, and she asks, "How long have you been here for?" I responded that I'd been here since we finished trimming her hair, and her face dropped. "So you weren't in the bathroom?" "No, I've been here the whole time." "So you haven't been talking to me?" I asked her to elaborate and get to the point. She replied with something that sent chills down my spine. "I was cleaning up the hair and realized I needed the deodorant, so I called out to you because I saw a shadow like you in the bathroom and asked you if you saw it in there. You responded in an annoyed tone that there was no deodorant in the bathroom and that I could look for myself. So I walked into the bathroom and I thought you'd be peeking behind the wall, hiding near the toilet or something. Maybe you were going to scare me." I didn't know how to respond to this because I hadn't heard any of it, because I had the headphones in, listening to music at a pretty high volume. It did frighten me though, and you'd have thought after this experience I might have decided to leave her house. But no. And then this other incident occurred. On this night, we experienced something I never thought was possible, and still shakes me to my core. We had just finished watching a movie at around 10 p.m, and she decides to use the restroom before we call it a night. She stood up from bed and walked to her bedroom door. She barely opened a crack and slammed it back shut, and fell to the ground in tears. Startled by this random change in emotion, I asked her what was wrong, but she kept crying and kind of laughing hysterically like you would out of intense fear. To be clear, we had just watched a children's movie, nothing remotely scary, so there was no reason for her to be jumpy like that. She finally calmed down enough to tell me that there was a figure, about 4 feet in height, slightly transparent, with fly-like eyes and a furry body, floating down the hall towards the bathroom. She had some trouble explaining what to compare this entity to, but struggled. She decided to just not go to the bathroom, and we immediately pulled out her laptop to see if we could Google anything, and surprise, we found nothing of use. After about an hour of rummaging through different websites and YouTube videos, we finally calmed down and gave up. Before I go on, let me paint a mental image of her bedroom for you. It was set up where her bed was in a corner facing the doorway, and to the right of that were 2 double-door closets. Once we shut the lights off and laid down, things got bad very fast. Keep in mind the door was shut, and her cat and dog do not sleep with her because she hates fur in the bed. We settled down and got under the covers, and after maybe 4 minutes it felt like something jumped on the foot of the bed. It felt like the weight of a medium-sized dog. I started smacking her arm, begging her to tell me whether she felt it, or that she accidentally let the dog in, but she only responded with, "Please just ignore it, I don't want to deal with it." I couldn't let it go. The weight started to feel like someone on all fours was crawling up the bed onto us. crawling, not like a small dog walking on a bed. I started to feel hot and breathing heavy out of fear, begging her to acknowledge what was happening. She continued to tell me to ignore it so that it would stop. But it got worse. Both closets opened and a weird rustling sound filled the room like someone was going through her things, and the weight got heavier and heavier. She stopped responding to me by this point and I was in tears. The most terrifying part of all was something she doesn't even remember. She began talking in a childlike voice, one not her own, telling me that it would all be over soon, and that he was here. I don't know who he was, but I didn't care to find out. The room had a stench of rotting dead animals, and the bed started to wiggle and shake, almost like it were pressed against a clothes dryer. But she wasn't moving. She was still not responding and giggling in this voice. By this point it was almost 3 a.m. and the activity had not come to an end. I began to feel knocks under the bed, and I am left to cry because I wasn't getting out of that damn bed alone. After a few minutes of the shaking and the stench, everything came to a very abrupt halt. My friend had stopped talking and giggling and asked me what happened, and seemed very confused by my irate tone of voice and tears. I know you may be thinking she was messing with me, but she would never stoop that low without telling me it was a joke later. This was probably the weirdest, most messed up experience of my life to this day. I think it could have been a demon. Maybe her dad brought something in, and a demon came attached to it. And I know many of you are probably scoffing at this, but perhaps if you'd have lived through what I did, you would understand why. I want to start by saying everything I'm about to share has been experienced by 3 people, including myself. My roommates and I moved into our dorm last September, and the strange occurrences started early. The first incident happened to one of my roommates, Amanda, while she was unpacking. She checked all of the drawers in her desk, finding them empty. Then she began unpacking her things and went to open one of the drawers to put her stuff in. That's when she discovered a small Hot Wheels car sitting in the middle. No one had been in the room. She hadn't left the room, and there's no way she could have missed that very specific toy in the middle. That was creepy. Things, of course, got worse. A few days later, the light outside her room began to flicker. We reported it to the building staff, not thinking anything remotely paranormal. Why would you? And the bulb was replaced. The flickering was persisted. Faulty wiring, sure. Over the following weeks, Amanda then began to hear what sounded like pacing in her room. Now, it could have just been someone in the hallway, but the sound always seemed to come from inside her room, and everyone who heard it would agree to that consensus. Then one day, Amanda walked in, and she saw a shadow figure standing in the corner of the room. She was terrified. Assuming someone had broken in, she flipped on the light switch, but it was gone. Last week, Amanda texted me while we were both in our rooms. The message read, "Is my boyfriend over?" I replied no, since it was noon on a weekday. Amanda responded, "I just heard a man coughing." She checks the hallway but found no one. When I joined her to search the dorm, it was empty. There were no men living in our building. Another time I heard footsteps coming from Amanda's room while she wasn't home. I checked the hallway, and as expected it was silent and empty. That gave me goosebumps. But the breaking point for me came over the weekend when I was alone in the dorm. It was around 10 p.m. I walked to the bathroom. All the hallway lights were off because I hadn't bothered to turn them on. As I'd come out of the bathroom, I noticed Amanda's bedroom light was on. I thought maybe she'd left it on before leaving for the weekend, and when I tried the door to turn the light off, it was locked. Later, Amanda told me not only had she turned the light off before leaving, but it was also off when she returned. Whenever I enter Amanda's room, I feel an oppressive pressure on my chest, something I can't explain. It's been happening more often, along with other unexplainable events. Like recently, Amanda smelled cigarette smoke in our smoke-free apartment, and I confess I faintly smelt it too, though none of our other roommates could. Strange odors have been popping up, ones we can't identify nor explain. One evening, I left the front door unlocked while walking my boyfriend out, expecting to be gone just 2 minutes. Well, when I returned, the door was locked. And get this, no one was home at the time, not a single roommate. Of course, I let myself in, assumed someone must have been there, and checked. Not a soul in the house, and I would have seen if someone would have come and gone. I can't explain that. The activity has only escalated. Amanda has seen shadow figures in her closet, and we once spotted the reflection of a man in the window. Amanda described him as an older man wearing a plaid shirt and jeans. Another time, while we were in the kitchen, Amanda thought I was standing behind her because she felt someone's presence. When she turned, she saw a full body apparition of the same man. As you can imagine, that frightened her profoundly. Not to mention the pressure I felt in Amanda's room started appearing in other parts of the dorm, and I've caught movement in reflective surfaces. There was this one day that we were decorating our Christmas tree, and I saw the man's reflection in the window again. He was sitting in the couch watching us. When I twisted my head to look at the couch, he was gone. That night, Amanda stayed in our other roommates, Teresa's room. Amanda was kept awake by tapping on the walls, noises coming from the closet, and even the sensation of the bed being physically moved. Teresa felt the bed shift but didn't notice anything else. A few days ago, I was in my room and felt the familiar pressure in my chest. I said out loud, "You're not welcome here, please leave." And within seconds, the pressure disappeared, but a shelf on the bathroom door slammed against the wall. The most recent event happened when I was alone. While getting ready for class, I heard the sound of a drawer opening in Amanda's locked room. I messaged Amanda to confirm she wasn't home. Later, I heard metal hangers clinking together in her closet, and as I pressed send on a text to tell her, the flickering hallway light, which I'd turned off earlier, suddenly switched on by itself. We nicknamed the ghost Henry, but things are becoming unbearable. We need advice on what to do. Saging isn't an option, so if there's any other way to address this spirit or demon or whatever it is, we are open to suggestions. When I was 15, I was living with my dad. We lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment that was upstairs. I wouldn't say the apartment was a hotspot for paranormal activity per se, but shortly after we moved in, some strange things started to happen. For some reason, my dad's room always gave me the creeps. Mind you, I'm not someone who's scared of the dark at all, but whenever I'd walk by his room and he wasn't home and the door was open, I always felt like someone was looking back at me through the darkness. I started to close his door when he wasn't home because the feeling of being watched from his room was overwhelming. One day I had walked from school and didn't see my dad's Jeep in the parking lot, so I figured he was going to do some handiwork for someone, and I went inside and put down my backpack and walked straight to his room and shut the door. I settled down into my room when I heard heavy stomping sounds from my dad's room. My heart stopped. My dad always wears these big steel-toed boots that are good for outdoor work or construction/carpentry. It sounded exactly like his heavy steps. I stopped for a moment to listen and walked close to his door. When I realized the light was on from the crack at the bottom of the door, I said, "Dad?" just to make sure my dad wasn't actually home. I know I didn't see his car outside, and I didn't see my dad taking a nap when I first went to close his door, and the light was not on. But maybe I'm losing my mind. No reply. I kept hearing the heavy steps. My second thought, did someone break in and hide in my dad's room? I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, and I kept hearing the sound of heavy boots walking around. I slowly walked back to his door and braced myself for a long minute before finally jolting the door open. But nothing. No one was there. I ran into his closet and slid the door open, knife in hand. No one. At this point, I think I'm crazy, so I brush it off and go about my day. But I'd hear footsteps time to time. Then one weekend night, while my dad was working his midnight to 8 a.m. graveyard shift as a security officer, I was watching TV in the living room when I heard the doorknob jiggling the front door. My eyes darted to the door as I froze, watching the doorknob jiggle for about a minute before a long stop. After it stopped, I got to check the peephole and there was no one there. I got in the habit of sleeping with the lights on and a weapon close, needless to say. When my dad returned home in the morning, he said, "I think someone tried to break in." I asked what he meant, and he signals for me to come outside to the door, and I see scratch marks and wood chipped away between the door and the frame around the knob. We chalked it up to a junkie maybe trying to break in. We lived in an area that was notorious for drug use and poverty, but it freaked us out, and my dad was always anxious to leave me alone after that. He started texting more and calling during his night shifts to check in, as I wasn't sleeping much at the time, obviously. Now, one school night where he was away working, everything seemed calm. No footsteps, no knobs jiggling, no ominous feelings in the apartment. I had texted my dad everything was good, and I was about to go to sleep, as I had to get up early for school, as I woke up around 6:30 a.m., got to use the restroom, and was particularly tired that day and didn't want to get into the shower quite yet. So I went to lay back down and scroll on my phone for a while. As I'm laying in bed, I hear the front door unlock. My dad usually gets off at 8 a.m., but I assume maybe he got out early, as he did from time to time. "Dad?" I called out, but there was no response. But I heard a grunting sound. It sounded like my dad was hurt, like the sound you make when your lips closed and you groan in pain if you stub your toe. But it was a deep groan. Working security at a casino and bar, my dad would often get into altercations with drunk patrons when he had to remove them. He'd been injured at work many times like this. "Dad, are you okay?" I called out again. Again, no reply. The groaning became louder, and I heard a dragging sound on the carpet simultaneously. I'm thinking maybe he hurt his foot or leg. The dragging and groaning noise trailed from the living room to the kitchen and onto the tile floor. And then I heard the fridge open and close. I called out to him one more time. "Dad?" No reply. Now I'm freaking out and sinking deep into my bed as my heart pounds. I heard the dragging noise on the carpet again, and the groaning turned into a growling noise like a dog or a wolf. And quickly the growling was a snarling, evil sound that I can't get out of my mind. I pulled the blankets over my head and started to pray and cry. I was shaking. The growling approached the doorway to my room. It was in my room. Loud. I could feel the anger and threat directed towards me. And then I heard the sound of a gust of wind. My light bulb blew out, and the lights went off, and it became dark and cold suddenly. My fight or flight kicked in at this point, and I jumped out of bed to face whatever it was. But I saw nothing, except, strangely, a gallon of water from our fridge in the middle of the floor that was not there when I had gone to the bathroom moments before. At this point, I'm too freaked out to pay that any mind, and I run out of my room to the front door and see no one in the living room. And the front door is locked. I unlocked the door and ran down the stairs crying. I immediately called my dad, who left work, and rushed home. I waited at the bottom of the steps until he arrived. He thinks that I had a bad dream. We moved out soon after because I just couldn't stand to be there anymore. Whatever it was, it didn't seem like a trapped spirit. I never had another experience like this anywhere I lived, before or after, and it's my only true paranormal experience. I believe it was a demon in the apartment that was mimicking my dad. Why that place, I have no idea. Why it mimicked my dad, I don't know. But it didn't follow me when we moved. And I will never forget the sound of it growling at me. Let me start off by saying that I've never really been sure about the afterlife. I am one of those people who has to see it to believe it. But my parents told me when I was really young, I used to see ghosts. They say at one point I got so scared, I asked all the ghosts to go away until I was 30. I don't really remember any of this, so I just assumed I had a vivid imagination. Apparently it worked, and they stopped showing up immediately. Well, I turned 30 last year, and about 6 months into the year they came back. Well, one did. I couldn't sleep. I was just laying there awake, and I'd figured I'd get up and walk around the house a little. You know, when you get that feeling that someone's standing right behind you. I had it so strongly, and I just assumed it must be my roommate. I think I felt the floorboards move a little. That's how I knew someone was there. So I turned around, fully expecting it to be my roommate, but it wasn't. It was this shadow in the shape of a person. Like a person made of just darkness. They were about a foot shorter than me, and they looked pretty large in weight. I stood there, looking at them kind of dumbfounded. I remember saying, "Oh my God." I guess they were looking at me because they paused for a moment and then they walked around me. I turned as they walked around me and watched them head towards the stove, and once they reached it, they vanished into thin air. So I just can't believe this. After all these years, I finally know the truth. Ghosts are real. Maybe even an afterlife is real. You think I would be scared, but I'm actually really excited. I kind of want to see more of them, and hope they show up again soon. I guess I've always been a bit of a weirdo. That way I've never been afraid of the dark or typical things like other people are. I wonder if I'm supposed to be a medium or something. Does anyone have any tips on how to pursue this and strengthen my abilities? And has anyone else seen one? Do they look like shadow people to you? I'd love more information, if you're willing to share. I was about 5 years old in the year 2012 and was on holiday with my mum and dad. We were staying in a hotel room with 2000s kind of decorations. I woke up in the middle of the night and all the lights were off and it was pitch black in the room. I was scared and wanted to get to my mum's bed, so I remembered that I sat up and stood up. That's when I saw a white face a bit further away from me with dark eye sockets with white in the middle of them. There was a mouth too and a distinctly small nose. I started walking towards it thinking it was my mum's face, and I was calling out to it. Then my mum turned the bedside lamp on, and she was on the opposite side of the room in bed. I looked back over to where the face was and it was gone. She asked me what I was doing, and I didn't know what to say because I was so confused. So she put me back to bed, and I fell asleep within minutes. I woke up that morning in the hotel still confused about what I saw, so I told my mum. But since I was just a child, she said it was probably just me imagining things. But I know I definitely wasn't. Annoyingly, neither my parents know which hotel it was that we stayed in since it was so long ago, so I can't look to the hotel's backstory or reviews. I'm wondering if anyone knows what kind of apparition I saw that night. When I was about 6, I strongly believe I was met with a ghost in my own house. One night I was watching TV in my living room on the couch, and I got distracted by a rocking chair moving back and forth. That was odd. The windows were open, but there was no wind blowing. This was in the fall season. We didn't need to use the AC. It was a little off, but I figured that it rocked back and forth because it was just a really old rocking chair. It stopped rocking a minute later and didn't move again. The next night when I was watching TV again, I heard a cup fall to the ground from the shelf. Something wasn't right. Why would it just fall like that? I thought it was probably just a draft, so I walked over to the kitchen area, which was right next to the living room, and picked the cup off the floor and placed it back where it was. Nothing happened again that night, or the next. The night after, I was watching TV yet again, and out of the blue a radio set which was on a desk right next to the TV turned off. This was not a draft. A radio set can't just turn on by itself. It would only turn on if someone turns it on manually. At this time I started crying and ran to my parents' room while I heard the radio still playing. I barged right in to see my mum on the phone with someone. I heard her say to whoever she was talking to, "Hold on a sec." She asked me what the matter was, and I exclaimed that the radio just turned on out of nowhere and I think the ghost did it. She rolled her eyes, sighed, and said, "Come walk with me." So we went together to the living room. When we got back there, the radio was now turned off. My mum then told me, "See, no such thing as ghosts." I told her I was being for real, but she didn't buy it. She walked back to her room and continued her conversation to whoever she was on the phone with. No sudden movements ever happened again. I was so scared to go into that living room for a while, but I eventually faced my fears later on. But it will always stick with me forever. I know most people don't believe in the paranormal, but I firmly believe that a ghost was in my house, way back when I was just a child. I finally saw a ghost, but I walked through it because I was starving and way too hungry to care. So this happened when I was cleaning the last bit of my hallway. I knew that as soon as I grabbed the little pile of dust with the rag, I could finish what I was doing and head down to the kitchen. I looked beside me and noticed a black, see-through being at least 6 foot tall, about 2.5 feet from me, at the end of the hall, right where I needed to go to get down the stairs. I remember in that moment thinking, well, screw it, I'm going, because I was so hungry I just didn't care. I walked right through it and pretended I didn't see anything and just swung down the stairs. I emptied my hands, grabbed what I had ready to eat from the fridge, and sat there eating, thinking how much more scared I would have been if I'd, say, left my room and simply seen it at the end of the hall. I think that would have probably been a problem. This is a story of when I became a true believer in the paranormal. I used to work in a floral shop in my late teens to early 20s. The shop was an old 1-story plus attic house. It was a small company, and I was very close to my co-workers who were women in their mid-50s. I was alone in the shop one afternoon, walking through the retail waiting area to the front display cooler. The retail area had a seating nook with a couch and armchair, plus a coffee table for bridal consultations. On my way back from the cooler, as I was turning, I saw a man sitting in the armchair. He was elderly and in a dark suit, and had a head full of white hair. Upon turning to face him directly, he wasn't there. I was creeped out but didn't want to react because it felt wrong to do so for some reason, so I just resumed my work and kind of put it out of my head for the day. Over the course of a few months, I kept seeing him, always when I was alone in the shop, and always in that chair. One day I got the courage to bring it up to my boss, and I asked her, "Have you ever felt or seen anything weird in the shop?" Her eyes went wide and she asked, "Not the guy in the chair?" I accepted him as very real after that, and would casually acknowledge him when I would see him. It was kind of not a big deal at all. One afternoon I was again alone in the shop doing some chores. Flower shops always have a lot of buckets to wash, so that was my Saturday chore. As the shop was a converted old house, there was a utility sink that used to be the laundry room. It was a cramped space. Standing at the sink, I turned to grab another bucket from the stack behind me. And he was right there, standing just to the right of the bucket stack, not 2 feet behind me. I jumped, did a startled, "Ah!" and dropped the bucket. I composed myself quickly, turned the utility sink off, and did the thing I have never stopped feeling bad about. I yelled at him and cussed and said he absolutely could not go creeping around right behind me. And after that day he was gone. I never saw him again. I wonder if others did. I'm 50 now, and this happened when I was 8 years old. Me and my dad just came back from 7-Eleven. He bought me a big gulp. Now, for those of you who don't know, the sheer size of this soda was about a 2-liter bottle in a huge cup. Anyway, I tripped coming in the back door, and the cup hit the floor, and my dad beat the ever-loving crap out of me and sent me to bed without dinner. So I'm in my bed crying and cried myself to sleep. Sometime through the night I woke up and had a strange feeling. I pulled the covers down off my head, and there was a woman at the foot of my bed in a white dress. I could see through her. I could see my bedroom door outline, so I slowly pulled the covers back over my head. Now before you say maybe it was my mum, she was murdered when I was 16 months old. It might have been her spirit trying to console me. I still am unsure, but it really frightened me at the time and oddly gave me a sense of comfort. The moment that turned me into a true believer in ghosts happened when I was stationed in Okinawa. One Saturday, my roommate and I were just hanging out in our barracks room watching Game of Thrones. Our desks were set up in a sort of divider between the beds, and at the open end of the room, his chair sat empty. Out of nowhere, the chair began rocking and swiveling on its own. At first, I didn't notice because I was focused on my phone. Then my roommate snapped at me, telling me to quit messing with him because it wasn't funny. Confused, I looked up, and that is when I saw the chair moving on its own. I jumped up, thinking he must be behind it somehow, but he was back against the wall on his bed, terrified. The chair finally stopped moving after a few minutes, but we were both so shaken that we bolted out of there and went to grab a stiff drink. Odd things like this happened often during the 2 years I lived in those barracks. Considering Okinawa's history as a major battlefield for centuries, especially during World War II's Battle of Okinawa, the bloodiest in the Pacific, it's impossible to say how many lives were lost on the island. One of our guys even found human bones while exploring a small section of jungle near our barracks. There were so many eerie experiences there that it's hard to keep track of them all. I remember one of my roommates waking up one night to see a shadowy figure standing over my bed. Apparently he heard me choking during a sleep apnea episode and saw the figure at the same time. Sleep paralysis was another strange and regular occurrence for me. It happened almost weekly while I was there, even though I'd never experienced it before, and haven't since I left. I consider myself a pretty level-headed person. I'm an upcoming artist, and I published my first story in a small magazine. But recently I had a sort of mental breakdown. I wasn't doing well. It's been 3 weeks since I came back from the mental hospital, but I was telling the doctors about how I had hit my head and knocked myself out 4 times in my life. I told them the story about how I'd lost an entire day that I don't remember, and I've never had a day like that since, and it got me thinking about some of my life's more bizarre events. From when I was 4, and a boy haunted me in my bedroom, and during the day I would talk to a man. According to my mum, I really wanted to tell these stories, and I've had people tell me what possible things could have happened, suggestions or even people who might have experienced the same thing. I want to start with one story and work my way down. The first one happened when I was 4, in 2001. I grew up in Montana, middle of nowhere between Polston and Rowan. I used to love the land, but hate the house. My first memory of that place is the thousands of multicolored spiders' eggs on the outside window seat. It was a weird carpeted perch beneath one of my home's windows that I loved to sit at. But at night I hated sleeping. I was always visited by this boy. He was the same height as me, but he was like the thinnest outline of a human body. His insides were filled with TV static, and I used to put my head under the blanket and peer out because he would laugh and walk around my bed. And I hated the weird thing he called a smile. My mother says during the day there were times she would catch me talking to the man. She states the most vivid story she can tell was when she was in the kitchen, and I came around the corner repeating, "Just stay there, right there," to which I asked if I could have something. She says I was often heard talking to the man, but at night, all she ever heard was me cry about the boy. She recently told me she didn't know until we moved out that someone had actually taken their own life in the room, which was my bedroom. My family owns a rather large farmhouse in West Virginia, a massive place with 25 bedrooms. It's actually been in our family since 1968, and my parents eventually converted it into a family retreat, which was perfect for hosting my 160 cousins. And despite all the love and memories tied to that house, there's always been a part of the house that gives me the creeps. And no matter how bright the day or full the house, That part of the farmhouse always left me with an uneasy feeling that someone or something was watching. You see, one night I woke up suddenly and instinctively glanced towards the far corner of the room near the foot of the bed. And standing there was a little girl. She was holding what appeared to be a teddy bear and dressed in overalls, staring silently. At first, I thought I must be dreaming. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, fully expecting the apparition to vanish. I squinted into the dim light, but to my horror, she was still there. Now my heart was pounding, and I started elbowing my wife, trying to wake her up. Groggy and annoyed, she mumbled, "What?" I whispered urgently, "Look at the corner, do you see her?" She froze. Then, without even glancing in that direction, she said, "If I sit up and see a little girl, we're leaving the house right now." That was all I needed to hear. I told her to go back to sleep and keep my eyes tightly shut. I scooted across the mattress towards the light switch, and when I finally turned on the lamp, the corner was empty. The girl had vanished, and there was nothing in the corner that would make it a trick of the light. Let's say some overalls on a chair or something like that. No logical explanation. Now, it wasn't the only strange experience I've had in that house, but it's one I'll never forget. And despite the eerie encounters, I love that place. It's full of history, memories, and a sense of home. We actually still own it, and make a point to visit every year. One morning around 5 a.m., I suddenly woke up without any apparent reason. I sat up in bed feeling a strange sense of alertness, and I turned my gaze towards the door. To my shock, the door creaked open slightly. Then a figure stepped halfway into the room. It paused for a moment, as if surveying the space before quickly retreating and slamming the door shut. The sound of the door slamming was sharp and unmistakable, echoing in the stillness of the early morning. The figure wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It had a faint glowing quality, reminiscent of the ways ghosts are often depicted in movies. Its face lacked any discernible features, just a smooth, blank surface that sent shivers down my spine. The figure was draped in what appeared to be a long robe or a dress, its edges glowing faintly, and it was moving as if caught in an unseen breeze. I sat there frozen in disbelief, but one detail made that encounter even stranger. The door had opened the wrong way, against the hinges. That alone was enough to convince me this wasn't a normal incident. This happened in my room in the army barracks on Fort Carson, a place I'd always considered ordinary and grounded in reality. I've never experienced anything like it before or since. I can't help but wonder, was this some kind of hallucination, maybe brought on by stress or fatigue? Or was it something more? Does anyone have a similar experience or any idea what this could possibly mean? The moment that turned me into a true believer of the paranormal might not sound dramatic, but it's one that still lingers in my memory. I was just a kid around 17 years old, hanging out at my ex's parents' house. We were sitting on her bed, chatting casually, when something completely unexplainable happened. Out of nowhere, the empty hangers in her closet began moving, not just a little wiggle. It was like someone had run their hand across them, sending them swaying back and forth with noticeable force. It wasn't subtle. We both stared at the closet completely stunned. There was no logical explanation. No fan was on, no windows or doors were open, and there wasn't even the faintest draft in the room. We had a clearer view into the closet, and the hangers just kept swinging as if moved by some unseen hand. We exchanged a look, a mixture of nervous laughter and genuine unease. In that moment, I felt the need to say something, so I nervously muttered, I mean you no harm, spirit, but I acknowledge your presence," or something along those lines. After that, the hangers gradually stilled, and nothing else happened while I was there to witness it. Later, My ex told me she'd experienced a few strange things in the house before. She mentioned doors closing on their own, which she thought might just be caused by open windows or air currents. But then she shared something else that added a layer of mystery to the whole situation. Apparently, after her dad's ex-wife left the house, he started feeling an inexplicable sense of unease, a heavy and almost oppressive vibe in the home. This was so unsettling to him that despite not being a particularly religious man, he called the priest to have the house blessed. This happened years before the incident with the hangers, but it always stuck with her. My ex had a theory. She believed the blessing might have trapped a spirit in the house and prevented it from moving on. I'm not sure what I make of that, but I do know what I saw that day. It was enough to make me a believer that there are things in this world that defy explanation. I want to start by saying that neither I nor my girlfriend are crazy. I've never experienced a ghost or anything paranormal before, and I describe myself as a pretty optimistic and grounded person. But tonight, something happened that genuinely unsettled me. My girlfriend was absolutely terrified, and her reaction made it hard not to believe her. She had just left my house and was heading home. I have a long driveway, and at the end of it there's a gate. Her automatic gate opener wasn't working, and she had to get out of the car to manually open it, drive through, and then get back out to close it again. It was during this routine process that everything took a turn. After closing the gate, she got back into her car and looked in her rearview mirror to check if the gate was fully shut. And that's when she saw it. Something or someone slouched over in her trunk. She described it as having a long neck and a strange posture, almost like it was hunched over unnaturally. She screamed, looked away, and when she looked back it was gone. She said it reminded her somewhat of the character Ennui from Inside Out 2, with its elongated neck and slouched, eerie posture. Completely panicked, she called me immediately. She was crying, bawling and freaking out like I've never seen her before. She begged me to come inside and check her car because she couldn't bring herself to do it. Honestly, her fear was so raw and real that it gave me chills. I grabbed a flashlight and went straight to her car. I checked the trunk, the back seat, everywhere, but there was nothing. Not a single thing out of place. I tried to reassure her, but she was adamant about what she saw. She admitted she'd felt sleepy just a few minutes before, but wondered if it could have just been a hallucination caused by her drowsiness. But at the same time, she was so sure of what she saw that it left me questioning. This wasn't just a vague feeling or a shadow out of the corner of her eye. She described it in enough detail to make me believe she saw something. What adds to the strangeness is that I live in a pretty remote area. There aren't many people around, especially at night, so the chances of it being an actual person are slim. When I asked her if it was white, hoping for a clearer description, she said she didn't get a good enough look for the color, but the posture is what stood out to her the most. Now I don't know what to think. Could it have been her dreams blending into reality because of how tired she was? Or was it something else entirely? All I know is that I've never seen her this terrified before, and it's definitely made me uneasy. What do you all think? Should I be worried? Or was this just a one-off experience? The urban legend I'm about to share with you is one that hits close to home. Literally, I live just down the street from Pheasant Hill Parks in Dyer, Indiana, near a school that sits right next to a stretch of woods. These woods are a place I've always avoided at night, and for good reason. I've walked them for years, often during the day, but there's always this unsettling feeling of being watched. The lingering unease eventually prompted me to start spreading the story I'd heard about them. The tale goes back to the early 1900s, long before the school and railroad tracks were built. Back then, the area was farmland, and a man lived alone in a deep cabin within the woods. He worked as a lumberjack in town, cutting trees to make a living. Years later, when the railroad tracks were constructed, they ran right behind his home. The story says that one fateful day while he was out cutting trees, a train came barreling through and he was struck and killed. His tragic death supposedly marked the area in a way that is still felt to this day. Because by the 1960s, local kids began telling stories about the man's ghost. According to legend, if you go into the woods on Halloween night, which is the anniversary of his death during the early hours, you might encounter him, whether it's his restless spirit or something else entirely. Those who dared to venture in claimed they've experienced strange and frightening things. I don't know how the true story is, but I decided to test it for myself about 3 years ago. I'll never do it again. That night as I walked through the woods, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. I heard noises, rustling, and faint whispers, and caught glimpses of things out of the corner of my eye. It felt like I had stepped into a scene straight out of the Blair Witch Project. It was terrifying, and I was left with no desire to return after dark. If anyone wants to test the legend in the modern day, I'd be curious to hear your experiences. But if you're brave enough to go, I highly recommend doing exactly what I did to optimize your chances of encountering whatever it is that still remains in those woods. Just be prepared, as those woods are not for the faint of heart. I was lying on the couch next to my boyfriend while he was playing a video game. I was just relaxing, scrolling on my phone. For context, I had no drugs or alcohol in my system. That's when out of the corner of my eye I noticed something small and black descending from the ceiling. At first I thought it was a spider. What else slowly lowers itself towards you from above? But when I shifted my focus to get a better look, I saw it wasn't a spider at all. It was a thin, black, worm-like thing about the length of a finger, moving in a way that resembled how a worm wiggles. I started flinching and pulling back instinctively, panicking the way you do when a bug gets too close, trying to figure out what it was and whether it was posing any danger. My boyfriend noticed my reaction and asked what was wrong. I just stammered, "What the hell is that? There's something floating." Just then, the thing changed direction, slowly floating upwards, as though it were weightless, like a feather caught in an invisible breeze. But there was no breeze in the room. I pointed at it and said, "Right there, see that?" My boyfriend looked confused and replied, "Where?" I kept pointing almost frantic, "That right there, do you see it?" But he insisted he couldn't see a thing. Now I was feeling crazy and kept asking, "You don't see it? You really don't see it?" I blinked several times, wondering if it could be something in my eye, but it wasn't. This thing was real, taking up space in front of me. It kept floating upwards slowly and steady until it reached the ceiling. Then it simply disappeared, vanishing as if it had passed through the ceiling like a ghost. I was left sitting there completely freaked out while my boyfriend continued to insist he hadn't seen anything. I stood up and turned on the overhead light, replacing the dim cozy light we'd been using. I paced around the area when I'd seen the thing disappear, hoping to spot it again in better light. But nothing. I rushed to the bathroom to check my eyes, wondering if maybe something was wrong with them. But no, I'm familiar with the eye floaters you sometimes get, but this was nothing like that. Eye floaters move with your gaze or vanish when you blink. This thing had been external, a tangible presence. Now I'm sitting here trying to process what just happened. My boyfriend thinks I'm stressed out. Today was Thanksgiving, and we just gotten home after visiting family. Yesterday had been a long day of cooking, but I'd felt perfectly calm and content when this happened. Did I hallucinate? Was it something paranormal? I've never experienced anything like this before, and I don't know how to move on with my night after seeing something so bizarre. Has anyone seen anything like this before? When I was 9 years old, I went to my computer room back home. Then I heard a voice saying my name twice. I thought it was my maid who called me out the window. When I looked, there was a face of a girl that was bleeding everywhere. I was terrified, and after staring at her for no more than 2 seconds, she vanished. I looked out the window but saw nothing after. That day, my family bought a new clock and it had a spider on it, and after that day I was afraid of spiders. I believe ghosts are real, Maybe it's a form of energy that can only exist in quiet places. I used to think it was fake, until I experienced it myself. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you all so much for listening. Special thanks to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. For some cool bonus content, follow the link in the description to find out more. More content on screen now if you are so inclined, and hopefully see you in the next one. Good night.